There are really four seminal theories in the field of second language acquisition that linguists and sociolinguists and even educational professionals are concerned about. The first is the notion, or Krashen's notion, of language acquisition. In general, sociolinguists in SLA view language as an innate human capacity that functions as a sort of, quote, pre-wired software. Particularly when individuals develop their first language, as the comic on the slide kind of shows. And this software kicks in automatically as we are exposed to the language around us. Generally speaking, no one explicitly teaches us these rules of the language. And this is understood as a natural process of what is called language acquisition. That is, the development of implicit rules of the language and how we use them. Now, language acquisition contrasts with language learning, which is the process by which we are taught the explicit rules of the language, usually after the age of 5 and usually in a more formal and academic or institutional context. Language learning and language acquisition, however, are not necessarily antithetical to one another, nor does one happen before the other. Rather, they can happen at the same time, and the processes can even complement each other in both first and second language acquisition, first and second language development. Well, first, I think these principles of language acquisition and language learning relate to, or can relate to, how we interpret and use standardized English test scores like TOEFL or IELTS. These assessments, to a great extent, measure explicit academic knowledge of English, and of course, depending on the individual assessment tool, they may not necessarily tell us how a speaker of English will communicate in informal conversations within and outside the classroom. So that's sometimes why we see students, let's say like Mona, who have high, or even Werner, who have high TOEFL scores coming into a US university, but we see in the classroom they're silent, or they more likely they have a lot of difficulty communicating in both speaking and writing, or even communicating on campus. Secondly, I think it's also important to understand that full language acquisition and full communicative competence, that is the ability to use the language, takes a long time, especially if it is a second language. And it is often subject to several biological and even situational factors related to age and maturity and social integration. The critical period hypothesis, which many of you are probably familiar with or at least intuitively understand, attempts to account for some of these biological as well as potential situational factors. The critical period hypothesis states that there is an ideal window of time to acquire a language fully in a linguistically rich environment, after which time language acquisition becomes much more difficult. Now, this age is usually set at the age of 12 for various reasons related to cognitive development, identity formation, and learning strategies that differ between children before the age of 12 and after. But scholars have placed it even earlier, as early as the age of 7. Now, certainly in a few high-profile cases involving first language acquisition, like the case of Jeannie, the wild child you may be familiar with, in cases like this, the critical period hypothesis seems to be strongly supportive, though not without its controversies. But in cases involving second language acquisition, there seems to be more scholarly debate, particularly the debate involving discussions of several factors that can shape the extent to which older learners can acquire a second language more fully in comparison or contrast to first language users. These factors involve whether the individual learner has a talent or ear for learning a language, how much exposure that learner has to a wide variety of authentic language input in the target language community. But language acquisition can also depend on the personality traits of the individual language learner. That is, learners who are more extroverted, those who seek out interactions with others in the language, who are unafraid of taking risks or making mistakes, who learn from their mistakes and ask questions, and those who are more open-minded and non-judgmental when it comes to living, studying, and interacting within a foreign community. These are all factors that can facilitate second language acquisition in older learners more fully. The communication accommodation theory attempts to explain the behavioral choices we make in order to attune or not attune, if you will, our communicative behavior to those we are communicating with, in terms of pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, and even nonverbal communication. In addition, it attempts to explain how those changes are perceived by others in the community. Particularly, sociolinguists examine patterns of convergence and divergence of these individuals' behavior with respect to that community, the community and its standards. So again, this is related to our 4 cases in that the issue of motivation and social integration play a key role in individual second language learner development. Particularly the key issues for our 4 hypothetical students, I think, involve the extent to which they feel fully integrated or want to be fully integrated into the target language community. I mean, do they form enclaves or groups of speakers from the same linguistic and cultural group, for example, rarely using English outside the classroom, as we often see in some cases? Are they often silent in the classroom due to fears of making mistakes or being seen as a foreigner? These are all issues, I think, that students, like the 4 hypothetical cases, experience. But the answer to these questions, I think, in each case, will shape their interactions while living and studying in the U.S., and may also shape their ability to acquire the language fully, as well as their ability to achieve academic success in their classes. BICS involves a type of informal language use, language that we use to get things done socially in the world, to apologize, to ask for help, to make a joke, to tell a story, to manage social relationships. It often involves a great deal of idioms, colloquialisms, if you will, less correct grammar and looser pronunciation, many cultural references and highly contextualized language, and implied meanings. CALP refers to a type of more formal academic language in different disciplinary contexts. It's a type of language that we use to demonstrate our knowledge in that discipline, our critical thinking, and our ultimate membership in a literate academic or professional community. Now, what I think is important here to know is what Cummins calls the threshold hypothesis. Cummins states that there is a threshold level of BICS that is required in order for an individual learner to acquire CALP fully in a given context. Those students, for example, such as Bufa, our Generation 1.5 student, whose formative years were spent in a non-English speaking context, may not have acquired sufficient levels of BICS in order to acquire CALP. That is, they may not have had sufficient exposure to everyday informal conversation in the language. They may have experienced interrupted exposure to this informal language and can be at a severe disadvantage when coming to the U.S. university to acquire CALP more fully.